The morning fog lifts over Naseby field. It is the 14th of June, 1645. 9:30 in the morning. And King Charles I of England is about to make the worst decision of his life. His nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, sits astride his war horse on the right flank. 25 years old. Brilliant. Reckless. His long, dark hair spills over cavalry armor blackened by a dozen battles. Behind him, 2,000 Royalist horsemen stamp and snort in the summer air. Across the shallow valley, 14,000 parliamentary soldiers wait in disciplined silence. They call themselves the New Model Army, and today they will prove that name is not merely propaganda. The king surveys the field from Dust Hill. His forces number only 9,000. He should retreat. His advisers beg him to retreat. His own Secretary of State will later write that fighting here was madness. But Charles Stuart does not retreat. He is God's anointed sovereign. Divine right flows through his veins. Parliament's rabble cannot possibly defeat heaven's chosen monarch. In 2 hours, that certainty will die screaming in a field of blood-soaked wheat. What happens next will send Charles to the executioner's block. It will birth constitutional government. It will echo through centuries, from the American Revolution to the fall of absolute monarchy across Europe. And it all begins with a single, catastrophic mistake. Not on the battlefield, but in the mind of a king who could not imagine losing. To understand what happened at Naseby, you must first understand the men who bled there. Not as historical abstractions, not as names in textbooks, as human beings, flawed, frightened, convinced they fought for God himself. Charles I of England was not born to rule. He was a second son, sickly, stammering, overlooked. His elder brother Henry was the golden child, the athletic prince groomed for kingship. When Henry died of typhoid fever in 1612, 12-year-old Charles suddenly found himself heir to 3 kingdoms. He never recovered from the whiplash. Charles grew into a man of rigid formality and almost pathological stubbornness. He stood only 5 feet 4 inches tall. He compensated with elaborate ceremony, with protocol that bordered on religious ritual. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his childhood stammer sometimes surfaced, a humiliation he masked with cold brevity, but beneath the icy exterior burned absolute conviction. Charles believed, truly, genuinely, with every fiber of his being, that God had placed him on the throne, that his authority flowed directly from heaven, that to question the king was to question the Almighty himself. This was not mere political propaganda. This was Charles's actual theology. When Parliament challenged his right to levy taxes without their consent, Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled alone for 11 years. When the Scots rebelled against his religious policies, Charles raised an army without parliamentary approval. When war finally erupted in 1642, Charles never once considered that God might side with his enemies. Divine right was not a negotiating position. It was his identity. By the summer of 1645, 3 years of civil war had killed perhaps 100,000 Englishmen. Cities had been besieged. Families had been torn apart. Brother had killed brother on a dozen battlefields, and Charles remained utterly convinced that victory was inevitable. God's anointed cannot lose. Oliver Cromwell was 46 years old when he rode onto Naseby field. He had not always been a soldier. Born to minor gentry in Huntingdon, Cromwell spent most of his life as a farmer and local politician. He raised cattle, he collected rents. He served one unremarkable term in Parliament in 1628, and was so forgettable that no contemporary account records a single word he spoke. Then came the war. Something broke open inside Oliver Cromwell when the fighting began. Or perhaps something finally found its purpose. At 43 years old, with no military training whatsoever, Cromwell raised a cavalry troop from his neighbors in East Anglia. He recruited specifically for religious conviction. He wanted men who believed they were doing God's work, not mercenaries, not pressed men, not frightened farmers handed pikes. True believers. And then he drilled them with a ferocity that shocked his contemporaries. Most cavalry in the English Civil War fought like medieval knights, glorious individual charges, each man seeking personal honor. Cromwell rejected this completely. His horsemen fought as a unit. They attacked at a controlled trot, knee to knee, conserving their horses' energy. They struck with massed weight rather than scattered speed. And crucially, they did not pursue. This was Cromwell's genius. After a successful charge, his Ironsides would reform, wheel, and strike again. They did not scatter across the countryside chasing broken enemies. They remained a coherent killing force. By 1645, Cromwell commanded over 3,000 of these godly cavalrymen. The Royalists feared them more than any other parliamentary force. But Cromwell was not merely a military innovator. He was a religious visionary, fighting what he believed was a holy war. He did not hate Charles Stuart personally. He grieved for the blood being spilled across England. But he had come to believe something radical, something that would shake European politics for centuries. He believed that kings were accountable to their people, not to God through the people, to the people themselves. On the morning of Naseby, Oliver Cromwell knelt in prayer with his officers. Contemporary accounts describe a strange calm that descended upon the parliamentary right wing. These men believed, with the same absolute conviction Charles possessed, that God marched with them. Two faiths, two certainties. Only one could survive. Prince Rupert was everything his uncle, the king, was not. Tall, physically imposing, charismatic, fearless to the point of lunacy. Born in Prague in 1619, Rupert was the son of Charles's sister Elizabeth and the ill-fated Frederick V, the Winter King of Bohemia, whose brief reign sparked the 30 Years' War. Rupert grew up in exile, fighting in the Protestant cause across Europe from the age of 14. By the time he arrived in England in 1642, 23 years old, he had already been captured in battle, imprisoned for 3 years, and freed through diplomatic negotiation. He brought continental military experience to a kingdom that had not fought a major war in decades, and he brought a cavalry doctrine that had swept through European battlefields. Charge at the gallop, strike with maximum impact, shatter the enemy's formation, pursue until they break completely. It worked brilliantly at Edge Hill, the first major battle of the Civil War. Rupert's cavalry smashed through the parliamentary left wing and chased the broken horsemen for miles. But there was a problem. While Rupert pursued, the parliamentary infantry nearly won the battle. The Royalist cavalry returned too late to exploit their initial success. The battle ended in bloody stalemate. The same pattern repeated at subsequent engagements. Rupert would win his immediate fight and lose the larger battle by disappearing at the crucial moment. His subordinates warned him. His uncle gently suggested more restraint. Even Rupert himself recognized the tactical error in his after-action assessments. But on the morning of Naseby, staring across at the parliamentary left wing, Prince Rupert saw what he always saw: enemy cavalry waiting to be broken, and his blood began to sing. The new model army's commander-in-chief was a man who defied easy categorization. Sir Thomas Fairfax was only 33 years old, but he had been fighting since the war's first weeks. He had been wounded at Marston Moor, a musket ball through his face that left permanent scars. He had led successful campaigns in the north, while other parliamentary generals squabbled over politics. Fairfax spoke little. He wrote less. Contemporary accounts describe him as melancholic, even depressive, a man who found no joy in war despite his considerable talent for it. But his soldiers loved him. Fairfax led from the front. At the siege of Helmsley Castle, he personally led the storming party. At Selby, He positioned himself in the thick of the fighting when a sensible commander would have directed from the rear. He was also politically astute enough to know his limitations. The new model army was Parliament's creation, a professional standing force intended to replace the ineffective regional armies that had fumbled the war's first years. Fairfax commanded its infantry and bore overall responsibility for its performance, but he delegated cavalry operations almost entirely to Cromwell. This was not weakness. This was wisdom. Fairfax recognized that Cromwell's Ironsides were the finest cavalry in England. He recognized that Cromwell possessed tactical instincts that bordered on prophetic, and he recognized that the coming battle might hinge entirely on which cavalry force maintained its discipline. On the morning of Naseby, Fairfax and Cromwell conferred briefly on the parliamentary right wing. Their deployment was nearly complete. The trap was set. How did England, peaceful, prosperous, united England, tear itself apart? The answer requires stepping back, understanding the accumulated grievances of decades, tracing the fault lines that finally ruptured in 1642. Charles I inherited a kingdom already straining under religious and political tension. The English Reformation had created a Church of England that satisfied almost no one. Catholics considered it heretical. Puritans considered it insufficiently reformed. Too Catholic in its rituals, too hierarchical in its structure. Charles himself favored high church Anglicanism with elaborate ceremonies and powerful bishops. His enemies called this popery by another name. Religion intertwined with politics. Charles believed that bishops were essential to royal authority, that attacking the church hierarchy was attacking the crown itself. Puritans believed that religious reform required political reform, that a king who defended corrupt bishops could not be trusted. Then there was money. Charles needed revenue. Parliament controlled taxation. The king and Parliament disagreed fundamentally about the terms of this exchange. Charles believed that certain royal prerogatives, ship money, forced loans, feudal dues, lay outside parliamentary authority. Parliament believed that taxation without consent was tyranny. Full stop. When Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament in 1642, he triggered open revolt. The king withdrew from London. Both sides raised armies. 3 years of catastrophic warfare followed. The English Civil War was not a simple contest between king and Parliament. It was a multi-front nightmare involving English Royalists, English parliamentarians, Scottish Covenanters, Irish Catholics, and various regional factions with their own agendas. Early battles produced no decisive result. Edgehill in 1642 ended in stalemate. Royalist victories at Adwalton Moor and Roundway Down in 1643 were offset by parliamentary success at Naseby. The king established his capital at Oxford. Parliament held London. The war dragged on, bleeding both sides. The turning point came at Marston Moor in July 1644. A combined parliamentary Scottish army crushed the Royalist forces in the north, killing 4,000 men and capturing an entire artillery train. Prince Rupert, for once, was the one pursued from the field. But even this victory proved inconclusive. Parliamentary generals quarreled over credit. The Earl of Manchester, commanding the Eastern Association Army, publicly stated that defeating the king would solve nothing, that Charles would remain king regardless of military outcomes, and accommodation was inevitable. Cromwell was furious. The war must be won, he argued. Won completely. Won in a way that forced the king to accept fundamental limits on his power. Parliament agreed. In winter 1644, they passed the self-denying ordinance removing members of Parliament from military command. They authorized creation of a new model army, 22,000 professional soldiers, properly paid, uniformly equipped, and commanded by officers chosen for competence rather than social rank. Sir Thomas Fairfax would command this new force. Oliver Cromwell, technically barred from command as a sitting MP, received a special exemption to lead its cavalry. The new model army mustered for the first time in April 1645. 2 months later, it would prove itself at Naseby. The Royalist strategy for 1645 centered on Prince Rupert's siege of Leicester. This prosperous Midlands town fell on May 31st after brutal fighting. Royalist soldiers sacked the city with medieval ferocity, looting homes, stripping civilians, committing atrocities that shocked even hardened contemporaries. Accounts describe streets running with blood, women violated, children murdered. Parliament was horrified and alarmed. The new model army, still assembling and untested, marched north to engage. What followed was a week of careful maneuvering. Fairfax probed for the Royalist main body. Charles, flush with victory at Leicester, initially planned to relieve besieged Royalist garrisons in the west. The two armies circled each other through the Northamptonshire countryside. On June 13th, Royalist scouts confirmed that the new model army was closer than expected, perhaps only a few miles away. Charles convened a council of war at the town of Market Harborough. The debate that followed would determine the fate of a kingdom. Charles's military position was not hopeless. His 9,000 men were veterans, seasoned by 3 years of war, loyal to their king, and recently victorious at Leicester. His cavalry, despite losses, remained formidable. His artillery was well supplied, but he was outnumbered. The new model army fielded approximately 14,000 soldiers. Their cavalry slightly exceeded Royalist numbers. Their infantry enjoyed an almost 2-to-1 advantage. Lord Digby, the King's Secretary of State, urged caution. The Royalist army's baggage train, supplies, and, crucially, the King's personal correspondence were all vulnerable. A retreat to Leicester would preserve these assets and allow time for reinforcement. Prince Rupert disagreed. The new model army was untested. Its infantry included raw recruits. If the Royalists struck now, before Parliament's new force gained confidence, they might shatter it completely. Charles faced a choice between prudence and pride. He chose pride. Later historians would debate whether this decision was militarily defensible. Some argue that retreat would have allowed parliamentary forces to concentrate further, making eventual battle even more lopsided. Others note that the terrain at Naseby favored defense and that the Royalists would be attacking uphill against a larger force. The King's own letters reveal his thinking. He expected to win. Divine right demanded it. On the morning of June 14th, the Royalist army marched south toward Naseby. They found the parliamentary force already deployed on the ridge beyond the village. There would be no more maneuvering, no more councils, only blood. Naseby Field occupied a shallow valley roughly 1 mile wide. The terrain was not dramatic. No cliffs, no rivers, just open farmland, some cultivated, some scrubby gorse and rabbit warrens. The ground rose gently on both sides. Parliament holding the northern ridge, Royalists assembling on the southern. Between them lay 600 yards of killing ground. The parliamentary army deployed first. Fairfax positioned his infantry in the center. 5 regiments of foot, perhaps 7,000 men in total. These soldiers carried pikes and muskets in roughly equal proportion. The pike-armed troops formed dense blocks. The musketeers lined out in front and on the flanks. On the parliamentary left, Commissary General Henry Ireton commanded approximately 3,000 cavalry. Ireton was Cromwell's future son-in-law, a capable officer, though not his father-in-law's equal. On the parliamentary right, Cromwell himself commanded 3,600 Ironsides. These were the best cavalry in England. Many had fought together for 3 years. They knew their commander. They trusted their training. Crucially, Fairfax positioned his army slightly back from the ridgeline. This was deliberate. The Royalists, approaching from the south, could not accurately assess parliamentary strength. They would have to commit to attack before understanding what they faced. Prince Rupert rode forward to scout. He saw the parliamentary left, Ireton's cavalry, visible on the ridge. He did not see Cromwell's Ironsides, concealed in dead ground to the east. He did not see the full depth of Parliament's infantry. He reported to his uncle that the enemy force appeared manageable. The Royalists advanced. King Charles dressed for battle. He wore armor beneath his embroidered coat, a steel breastplate and backplate, gauntlets, and a helmet he would later remove to rally his troops. He carried a brace of pistols and a cavalry sword. The king did not intend to lead charges personally. His role was symbolic, the sacred body of the anointed monarch, present to inspire his soldiers. But he would come dangerously close to combat before the day ended. The Royalist army deployed as it marched. Prince Rupert took the right wing with approximately 2,000 cavalry. His objective? Ireton's horsemen on the parliamentary left. Lord Astley commanded the centre, perhaps 4,000 infantry, including veteran regiments from the Oxford army. These were hard men. They had sieged cities, stormed fortifications, and buried their comrades for 3 years. Sir Marmaduke Langdale commanded the left wing, perhaps 1,600 cavalry, the weakest portion of the Royalist line. Langdale's northern horse were brave but poorly equipped compared to Rupert's Cavaliers, and they would face Cromwell's Ironsides. The king and his reserve, approximately 1,200 cavalry and the king's life guard, remained behind the centre. At approximately 10 o'clock, the Royalist line began its advance. The Battle of Naseby had begun. Prince Rupert did not wait for his infantry. He saw Ireton's cavalry on the parliamentary left. He saw open ground between them. He did what Prince Rupert always did. He charged. 2,000 Royalist horsemen surged forward, building speed across the valley floor. Their objective was roughly 800 yards away, a minute's hard gallop. The ground was treacherous. Rabbit warrens pocked the field, invisible hazards that could snap a horse's leg. Patches of gorse caught at hooves. Men fell before a shot was fired. But Rupert's cavalry was experienced. They navigated the obstacles. They maintained formation. They struck Ireton's line with shattering force. The impact was audible across the battlefield, a thundering collision of horse and man and steel. Ireton's cavalry broke. Not all at once. Not everywhere. Parliamentary horsemen on the right of Ireton's formation held for several minutes, fighting desperately in swirling melees. Ireton himself received a pike wound to the face and a sword cut to the thigh. He fought on until a second wound unhorsed him, but the left collapsed. Parliamentary cavalry fled northwest toward Naseby village. Rupert's men pursued. Here was Rupert's fatal flaw. He should have stopped, reformed, struck the now exposed flank of Parliament's infantry. This was what Cromwell would do on the opposite wing, and it would win the battle. Instead, Rupert chased the fleeing horsemen for over a mile. When he finally regrouped his scattered cavalry, the battle had been decided without him. On the parliamentary right, Oliver Cromwell watched Rupert's charge with cold calculation. His opponent was Sir Marmaduke Langdale, an experienced commander with inferior numbers and inferior ground. Langdale's position on the Royalist left was lower than Cromwell's starting point. The Ironsides would charge downhill. Cromwell waited. He waited until Rupert's cavalry was fully committed to their charge on the opposite flank. He waited until Langdale's men were stationary, watching their comrades' success. Then he attacked. The Ironsides advanced at a controlled trot. Not a wild gallop, a measured, disciplined approach that conserved their horses' wind and kept their formation tight. Langdale's cavalry countercharged. The two forces met with less dramatic impact than Rupert's collision, but far more devastating result. Cromwell's first wave struck Langdale's front. Parliamentary horsemen in the second line swept around the flanks. Langdale's northern horse found themselves encircled, outnumbered, and suddenly fighting for survival. Within 15 minutes, the Royalist left wing ceased to exist as a coherent force. Langdale's men fled, not northwest like Ireton's broken cavalry, but east toward Market Harborough and safety. They would not return to the battle. But Cromwell did not pursue. This was the moment, the hinge upon which the entire war would turn. Cromwell gathered his Ironsides. He reformed their ranks, and he turned them toward the Royalist centre. The infantry battle had reached its crisis. While cavalry clashed on both wings, the infantry lines advanced toward each other. This was the killing work of 17th-century warfare, pike and musket, blade and lead, close-range slaughter on a scale that would not be seen again until the machine guns of 1914. The ground between the two armies was not flat. A shallow depression, almost imperceptible from a distance, ran across the valley floor. Patches of furze and gorse dotted the landscape. The soil was heavy clay, softened by recent rain, already churned by the cavalry engagement on the flanks. Men's boots sank ankle-deep with each step. The sucking sound of mud accompanied every footfall. The wheat in nearby fields stood chest-high, green stalks soon to be trampled and stained. Above the armies, the June sun climbed toward its zenith. The morning fog had burned away completely. Heat began to build, unusual for an English summer, but welcome to neither side. Men sweating beneath breastplates and helmets would soon be fighting in conditions that drained strength with every passing minute. Flies had already gathered. They always knew. Lord Astley led the Royalist foot forward. Contemporary accounts describe the veteran commander. He was 66 years old, kneeling briefly in prayer before the advance. His words, reportedly, were simple. "Lord, thou knowest how busy I must be this day. If I forget thee, do not thou forget me." Then he rose and shouted, "March on, boys." The drums began their steady rhythm. Each Royalist regiment carried its own drummers, boys as young as 12, some of them, their instruments strapped across their chests. The beat was not martial music in any modern sense. It was communication. Different rhythms signaled different commands: advance, halt, wheel left, wheel right. In the chaos of combat, when shouted orders vanished in the din, drums kept formations coherent. The sound rolled across the valley like approaching thunder. 4,000 men moving as one. Their boots found the rhythm, left, right, left, right. The pikes, carried vertically during the advance, swayed like a forest of steel-tipped trees. Sergeant Edmund Price marched in, the third rank of Sir George Lisle's regiment. We know his name from pension records filed years later. He was 34 years old, a butcher from Worcester before the war, and he had fought at both Edgehill and Marston Moor. His left hand bore scars from a pike wound received at Cropredy Bridge the previous summer. The wound had healed poorly. His grip on his own pike was weaker than it had once been. Price watched the parliamentary line drawing closer with each step. He could see individual faces now, men in pot helmets and leather coats, men gripping their pikes just as he gripped his, men who would try to kill him and whom he would try to kill in a matter of minutes. His mouth was dry, his heart hammered against his breastplate. He had felt this fear before, every battle, the same sick terror, and he had learned to march through it. Fear was not cowardice. Fear was natural. Cowardice was letting fear stop your feet. His feet kept moving. Across the valley, parliamentary musketeers opened fire. The range was approximately 100 yards, extreme for matchlock muskets, but not beyond capability. The first volley was more psychological than lethal. Smoke billowed across the field. The crack of discharging weapons echoed off the ridges. But what seemed simple in description was chaos in execution. A matchlock musket required over 40 distinct motions to load and fire. The musketeer carried a burning slow match, a chemically treated cord that smoldered constantly. He carried powder charges in wooden containers hanging from a bandolier. He carried lead balls in a pouch. He carried a ramrod, wadding priming powder. To fire, he opened a powder container, poured the charge down the barrel, followed it with wadding and ball, rammed the load home, poured priming powder into the pan, blew on his match to ensure it burned hot, cocked the serpentine that held the match, aimed and pulled the trigger. Skilled musketeers could complete this sequence in 30 seconds, under fire, with hands shaking and smoke stinging their eyes. Many took twice as long. The first parliamentary volley was ragged. Not a simultaneous crash, but a rippling staccato as different companies fired at slightly different moments. Smoke obscured the view almost immediately. The acrid stench of burned powder filled the air, mixing with the smell of the smoldering match cords. White-grey clouds drifted across the field. Through this haze, the Royalists kept advancing. The Royalists did not pause. They continued forward, absorbing sporadic fire, closing the distance to killing range. This was where training mattered most. An untrained soldier, hearing musket balls whistle past his ears, seeing the man beside him suddenly drop with a bloody hole in his chest, would naturally want to stop, to take cover, to run. Every instinct screamed retreat. But the veterans of Lord Astley's regiments had learned a terrible truth. Stopping was death. A stationary target was easier to hit. Man who broke formation was alone, vulnerable, certain to be cut down. Safety, such as it existed, lay in maintaining the wall of pikes, in trusting your comrades, in reaching the enemy line where muskets became useless and pike skill determined survival. So they marched through the fire. John Hewitt, an ensign carrying the colors of Sir Bernard Astley's regiment, felt a musket ball tug at his sleeve. The fabric tore. The ball missed his arm by less than an inch. He stumbled, caught himself, kept the flag upright. The colors were everything. In the smoke and confusion of 17th century battle, soldiers oriented on their regimental colors. Lose the flag, and men lost their unit. Lose the flag, and a regiment could dissolve into a terrified mob. Ensigns were specifically targeted by enemy musketeers. Killing the color-bearer was worth more than killing 10 common soldiers. Hewitt knew this. He had seen 3 ensigns fall at Marston Moor. He had taken up the colors over their bodies. He was 17 years old. He kept marching. At 50 yards, the Royalist musketeers halted, leveled their weapons, and delivered a coordinated volley. Parliamentary soldiers fell. The impact of a musket ball at close range was horrific. These were not the high-velocity, small-caliber rounds of modern warfare. They were lead spheres nearly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, traveling at perhaps 900 feet per second. They did not punch neat holes. They shattered bones, pulverized organs, tore chunks of flesh the size of fists from their victims. Men hit in the chest died quickly, if they were fortunate. Men hit in the limbs faced amputation or slow death from blood loss. Men hit in the abdomen faced hours of agony before the end. The parliamentary line staggered. Philip Skippon, the veteran commander of Parliament's infantry, rode behind his regiments, shouting encouragement. Skippon was 57 years old, a professional soldier who had fought in the Netherlands and Germany before the Civil War. He was possibly the most experienced infantry commander on either side. A musket ball struck him in the side. The ball penetrated beneath his breastplate, lodging somewhere in his abdomen. Skippon lurched in his saddle. Blood soaked through his coat. His officers urged him to retire. He refused. "I will not stir," he reportedly declared, "so long as a man will stand." He continued commanding with a bullet inside him. He would survive, barely, but his wound meant that parliamentary infantry coordination suffered at the crucial moment. Then the pikes engaged, 16-foot ash poles tipped with steel points, wielded by men in helmets and breastplates, thrust forward, braced against the ground, or swung in wide arcs to hook enemies from their feet. The initial contact was almost anticlimactic. The front ranks of each formation slowed as they approached. No one wanted to impale himself on an enemy pike. The 2 bristling walls of steel came together. Tentatively, points probing, men shuffling their feet, seeking advantage. Then the rear ranks pushed. The push of pike, was exactly what it sounded like. Men in the back ranks pressed forward with their shoulders, shoving the men in front of them toward the enemy. The front ranks had no choice but to advance. The two formations compressed against each other like wrestlers grappling. In this crush, the long pikes became unwieldy. Men in the front ranks often dropped their 16-foot weapons and drew swords. Some carried shorter weapons specifically for this moment, tuck swords with narrow thrusting blades or heavy falchions for hacking. The fighting became intensely personal. Face to face, close enough to smell your enemy's breath, close enough to see the terror in his eyes. The noise was indescribable. Steel clashing on steel, men screaming, battle cries, prayers, incoherent sounds of rage and fear. Officers shouting orders that no one could hear, the deep groan of thousands of men straining against each other, the wet sounds of blades finding flesh, and beneath it all, the drums kept beating. While the pike blocks ground against each other, musketeers on both flanks continued their deadly work. They could not fire into the central melee, too much risk of hitting their own men. Instead, they targeted the enemy's flanks, pouring fire into exposed formations, cutting down pikemen from oblique angles. When their ammunition ran low, or when enemies closed to contact, musketeers became infantry themselves. The musket, unloaded, became a club. The heavy wooden stock could crush a skull through a helmet. Some musketeers carried swords or daggers as secondary weapons. Others simply grabbed fallen pikes and joined the push. Thomas Rainborough's regiment, positioned on the parliamentary left centre, found themselves outflanked by Royalist musketeers who had worked around through the gorse bushes. Fire poured into their exposed side. Men fell in clusters. Rainborough himself, a future radical who would argue for universal manhood suffrage in the Putney debates, rallied his musketeers to face the new threat. They formed a rough firing line, exchanging volleys at distances measured in paces rather than yards. The casualties were appalling. Contemporary accounts describe bodies stacked 3 deep in some locations. Men tripped over corpses, slipped in blood-soaked mud, fell and were trampled by both sides. The wounded who could not crawl away were crushed beneath the boots of men too focused on survival to notice what they stepped on. The center of the battlefield became a grinding melee. Parliamentary infantry outnumbered their Royalist counterparts significantly, but Royalist quality partially compensated. These were veteran soldiers, men who had seen pike pushes at Edge Hill and Marston Moor, who knew how to step over fallen comrades and keep pressing forward. For perhaps 30 minutes, the outcome remained uncertain. The experience of those 30 minutes defies comfortable narration. Men fought until their arms trembled with exhaustion. The 16-foot pikes, made of ash, iron-tipped, surprisingly heavy, drained strength with every thrust. After 10 minutes, even strong men felt their muscles burning. After 20, movements became sluggish, desperate. The June heat worsened everything. Men in breastplates and helmets baked beneath the sun. Sweat poured into eyes, stinging, blurring vision. Some soldiers vomited from heat and terror combined. Others simply collapsed, overcome by exhaustion, only to be trampled or stabbed where they lay. Thirst was agonizing. There was no water on the battlefield. Men who had marched since dawn, who had fought for their lives for half an hour, felt their tongues swelling in parched mouths. Some became delirious. Others, driven beyond endurance, simply stopped fighting and stood swaying, waiting for death. And still the push continued. Sergeant Edmund Price, the butcher from Worcester, found himself in the front rank after the men ahead of him fell. His weakened left hand betrayed him. His pike slipped as he thrust, the angle wrong, and a parliamentary soldier inside his guard drove a sword into his thigh. Price went down. The battle surged over him. He curled into a ball, arms wrapped around his head, as boots kicked and trampled. Something heavy, a falling body, landed across his legs. Blood pooled beneath him, his own mixing with others. He would survive. Crawling from the field an hour later, he would be found by Royalist camp followers and carried to a surgeon. His leg would be saved, barely. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But in that moment, pinned beneath the dead and dying, Edmund Price knew only the intimate horror of a 17th-century battlefield. The stench of blood and excrement, the screaming of wounded men, the knowledge that death stood inches away and would not be denied forever. Then the Royalist veterans achieved something remarkable. They broke through. Sir George Lysel's regiment, the same unit where Sergeant Price had served, found a weak point in the parliamentary line. The regiment facing them was newly raised, its soldiers experiencing their first major battle. When Lysel's veterans pushed with concentrated fury, the Green troops wavered. Then they broke. The collapse was sudden. One moment, a parliamentary regiment stood fighting. The next, men in the rear ranks were turning, running, throwing away their pikes to flee faster. The panic spread like fire in dry grass. A gap opened in Parliament's centre. Royalist officers saw it immediately. Colonel George Lysel himself, fighting on foot among his men, shouted for the advance. His regiment surged forward into the breach, widening it, exploiting it, threatening to split Parliament's army in half. This was the crisis. If the Royalists could pour through this gap, if their reserves could follow up, the parliamentary infantry might disintegrate entirely. A rout would follow. And in 17th-century warfare, a routed army was a destroyed army. Fleeing infantry could be ridden down by cavalry with almost no losses to the pursuers. The entire war hung in the balance. Sir Thomas Fairfax was everywhere. The parliamentary commander rode through the carnage, rallying broken units, directing reserves, exposing himself to fire with reckless disregard. At one point, Fairfax lost his helmet in the chaos. He continued fighting bareheaded, an image that his soldiers would remember for decades. Fairfax was not merely directing traffic. He was personally engaging in combat. Contemporary accounts describe him cutting down at least one Royalist officer with his own sword. His horse was wounded beneath him. He transferred to another. His coat was slashed in multiple places. Blood, his own, his enemies', perhaps both, stained his hands. This was leadership by example. Fairfax could have commanded from a safe distance. He chose not to. His presence in the thick of fighting told his soldiers that their general shared their danger, that he would not ask them to die while he watched from safety. It mattered. Men who might have fled saw Fairfax fighting and found their courage renewed. Officers who might have despaired saw their commander still in the saddle and rallied their fragments of units. But the centre was buckling. Royalist infantry, despite their inferior numbers, had shattered one parliamentary regiment entirely. Fairfax's own regiment was pushed back. The line began to waver. The gap widened. More Royalist soldiers poured through. The Parliamentary Infantry Reserve, Colonel Pride's regiment, held back for exactly such emergencies, marched forward to seal the breach. They arrived just in time. Pride's men crashed into the advancing Royalists with fresh energy. The push resumed. The gap stabilized, narrowed, held. But it was a near thing, desperately near. King Charles watched from Dust Hill. He sat astride a magnificent grey horse, surrounded by his lifeguard, gentlemen volunteers, many of them nobles, all of them armed and armoured for battle. Behind him waited his reserve cavalry, 1,200 horsemen who had not yet engaged. Charles could see the breakthrough. Through the smoke, through the confusion, he could see his infantry pushing forward. He could see the parliamentary line bowing inward. He could see, with sudden clarity, the opportunity to end the war. If the Royalists could exploit this breakthrough, if Prince Rupert's cavalry could return to strike the parliamentary rear, the battle might still be won. Charles gathered his reserve cavalry, 1,200 horsemen, including his personal lifeguard. He prepared to lead them forward into the gap to shatter Parliament's army and end the war. The horses stamped and snorted. The king's standard-bearer unfurled the royal banner. Officers drew their swords. Charles himself was transformed. The hesitant, stammering monarch became something else. A man of action, a king leading his people, the anointed of God descending to smite his enemies. He spurred his horse forward, and then his advisers intervened. What happened next remains controversial among historians. The Scottish Earl of Carnwath was riding beside the king. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Carnwath seized Charles's bridle at the critical moment, shouting that the king must not risk his sacred person in common cavalry melee. "Will you go upon your death?" Carnwath reportedly cried. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. If Charles fell in battle, the Royalist cause would collapse entirely. His heir, the future Charles II, was a teenager with no military experience. The coalition of nobles, gentry, and soldiers who fought for the king were bound by personal loyalty to Charles himself. Without him, their army would dissolve into competing factions. The sacred person of the king was the cause. Charles halted. The reserve halted behind him. For a long moment, perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps 30, the 1,200 horsemen sat motionless, awaiting orders, awaiting the command that would send them thundering into the breach. The command never came. Other accounts suggest Charles himself hesitated, that the sight of Cromwell's Ironsides reforming on the Royalist left gave him pause. The cavalry that should have protected that flank was fleeing toward Market Harborough. Sir Marmaduke Langdale's northern horse were broken, scattered, pouring off the field in disordered flight. If Charles committed his reserve to the center, nothing would stop Cromwell from rolling up the entire Royalist line. The king was not a trained soldier. He lacked the tactical instincts that came from years of field command. He saw the opportunity in front of him. He also saw the danger behind. Paralysis gripped him. Whatever the cause, the moment passed. The reserve did not charge, and Cromwell's Ironsides were already moving. On the eastern edge of the battlefield, Oliver Cromwell made the decision that would destroy a monarchy. His cavalry had shattered Langdale's northern horse. The Royalist left wing had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The temptation to pursue, to chase the broken enemy, to capture or kill as many as possible, was enormous. This was what cavalry did. This was what Rupert had done on the opposite flank. Cromwell refused. He understood something that Rupert never grasped. Cavalry that left the battlefield could not influence the battle. 1,000 prisoners meant nothing if the infantry lost. A glorious pursuit meant nothing if the army was destroyed while the cavalry was elsewhere. Cromwell gathered his Ironsides. The process took precious minutes. His cavalry had scattered during the pursuit of Langdale's routed horsemen. Officers rode through the chaos, shouting commands, physically grabbing men's bridles to halt their chase. Trumpeters sounded recall. Slowly, reluctantly, the Ironsides reformed. 3,000 horsemen, winded, their horses lathered, their swords red with Royalist blood, but organized, disciplined, ready. Cromwell looked toward the center of the battlefield. He could see the Royalist breakthrough. He could see parliamentary infantry struggling to hold. He could see, with the same clarity Charles had seen from the opposite side, that the battle's outcome remained undecided. He also saw the Royalist reserve, motionless on Dust Hill. Charles had not committed. The king's 1,200 horsemen sat watching. Cromwell did not know why. He did not care why. He only knew that the Royalist flank was exposed, unprotected, inviting attack. He gave the order. The Ironsides wheeled left and charged. 3,000 parliamentary cavalry struck the Royalist infantry from behind. The approach took perhaps 2 minutes. The ground was rough, broken by gorse and rabbit warrens, but Cromwell's men navigated it with practiced skill. They maintained formation, they maintained discipline, they struck as a single, concentrated mass. The Royalist infantry never saw them coming. Imagine the terror. You are a Royalist pikeman. You have been fighting for an hour. Your arms ache from wielding 16 feet of ash. Your comrades lie dead around you, but you are winning. The parliamentary centre is breaking. Then you hear hoofbeats behind you. The sound is distinctive. Hundreds of horses at the gallop, the earth trembling beneath their weight. You know what it means. You know what is coming. You turn. You see a wall of cavalry, disciplined, fresh, unstoppable, sweeping toward your unprotected backs. There is nowhere to run. Pike formations are designed to face one direction. The long weapons point forward, presenting a wall of steel that cavalry cannot charge through. But this defense requires facing the threat. Pivoting a pike block, hundreds of men moving in coordination, takes time. There was no time. Cromwell's first charge carved through the Royalist rear like a blade through cloth. Men went down in heaps. Cavalry sabers rose and fell with mechanical rhythm. The Ironsides were not frenzied, they were methodical. Their horses were trained to push through infantry, knocking men aside with sheer mass. Their swords were designed for the downward cut, a stroke that opened skulls through helmets, severed arms, split shoulders to the breastbone. They killed with professional efficiency. Royalist soldiers in the rear ranks died first. Men who had been pushing forward, lending their weight to the pike push, suddenly found themselves facing horsemen instead of friendly backs. Some tried to turn and fight. Most simply fell. The panic spread forward. Men in the center of the pike blocks felt the pressure behind them disappear. The push faltered. They looked back and saw cavalry among their rear ranks, saw their comrades dying, saw the formation dissolving. They ran. The Royalist infantry, so close to victory moments before, began to disintegrate. This was not an orderly retreat. This was not a fighting withdrawal. This was collapse, the complete psychological breakdown of a military force that had believed itself winning and suddenly understood it was dying. Men threw away their pikes. The heavy weapons, so valuable in formation, became deadly encumbrances in flight. They threw away their helmets. They threw away their breastplates. Anything that slowed their desperate flight was abandoned. But there was nowhere to flee. Cromwell's cavalry had swept around from the east. Parliamentary infantry held the north. The only escape was south and west, back toward the Royalist starting positions, toward Dust Hill, toward the King. Thousands of panicked men surged in that direction. They crashed into their own reserves. They blocked the paths of officers trying to restore order. They communicated their terror to soldiers who had not yet engaged, spreading the psychological contagion of defeat. King Charles watched his army die. From Dust Hill, he saw the tide of fleeing infantry. He saw Cromwell's cavalry cutting through the chaos. He saw his breakthrough, his moment of victory, transform into catastrophe. His reserve cavalry still sat motionless. What could they do now? Charge into that maelstrom of fleeing men and pursuing horsemen? They would kill as many of their own soldiers as enemies. They would accomplish nothing except adding to the slaughter. Charles had hesitated too long. The opportunity had passed. Meanwhile, Fairfax reorganized his shattered center. The Royalist breakthrough had been contained. Pride's regiment held the breach. And now, with Cromwell's cavalry wreaking havoc behind the Royalist line, the pressure on Parliament's infantry evaporated. Fairfax saw his chance. He ordered a general advance. Parliamentary infantry that had been retreating found their courage returning. They surged forward against an enemy now fighting on two fronts. The men who had been fleeing stopped fleeing. The men who had been dying stopped dying, or at least stopped dying in such numbers. The momentum shifted with brutal suddenness. Royalist soldiers who had been pushing forward now faced pikes from the front and cavalry from behind. They were trapped, they were surrounded, they had no options. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Parliamentary soldiers accepted their surrender, mostly. In the chaos, some prisoners were killed anyway, cut down by men too blood-maddened to recognize submission. Others fought on, knowing death was certain, but preferring battle to slaughter. Small knots of Royalist infantry formed improvised hedgehogs, pikes pointing outward, selling their lives as dearly as possible. Cromwell's cavalry avoided these formations. Why take casualties destroying men who were already defeated? The horsemen swept around the stubborn clusters, pursuing the fleeing mass, killing those who ran. The killing became methodical. Prince Rupert finally returned to the battlefield. He had chased Ireton's broken cavalry all the way to Naseby village, nearly 2 miles from the main engagement. He had attacked the parliamentary baggage train, hoping to capture supplies, ammunition, perhaps even Fairfax's war chest. The attack failed. Parliamentary guards and armed servants defended the wagons with unexpected ferocity. Rupert's cavalry, winded from their long pursuit, could not break through. Precious minutes slipped away while the prince wasted his strength on a secondary objective. Now, reorganizing his scattered horsemen, he looked back toward the main engagement. What he saw ended any hope of Royalist victory. The infantry center was collapsing. Cromwell's cavalry roamed the field at will. The King's Reserve, intact but immobile, stood paralyzed on Dust Hill. Worse, Rupert could see the scale of the disaster. Thousands of Royalist infantry were fleeing. The carefully maintained formations had dissolved into a terrified mob. Bodies littered the field in windows and heaps. The smoke was beginning to clear, revealing a landscape of carnage. Rupert gathered what cavalry he could. Perhaps 800 horsemen, less than half his original force. The rest were scattered across the countryside, lost in the pursuit, or already fleeing toward Leicester. He attempted a final charge. The target was Cromwell's Ironsides, the force that had destroyed the Royalist left and now threatened to destroy everything else. If Rupert could shatter Cromwell's cavalry, perhaps the battle could be salvaged. Perhaps the infantry could rally. Perhaps retreat could be conducted in good order. His depleted cavalry struck at Cromwell's Ironsides and bounced off. The parliamentary horsemen, still in disciplined formation, absorbed the impact and countercharged. This was the difference between Rupert and Cromwell. Rupert's cavalry had exhausted themselves in pursuit. Cromwell's cavalry had maintained their energy through discipline. When the two forces met, the outcome was inevitable. Rupert's men broke, not in good order, not as a fighting withdrawal. They simply fled. Prince Rupert himself, legendary for his refusal to accept defeat, had no choice but to join the rout. He spurred his horse toward the king's position, seeking to organize whatever resistance remained possible. He found Charles surrounded by his lifeguard, watching the destruction of everything he had believed inevitable. The Battle of Naseby had lasted approximately 2 hours. In that time, approximately 1,000 Royalist soldiers were killed and 4,000 captured. Parliamentary losses were lighter, perhaps 200 dead, considerably fewer wounded. The numbers obscure the totality of the defeat. The Royalist infantry had ceased to exist, not reduced, not damaged, destroyed. The veteran regiments that had fought since Edgehill, the core of Charles' military power, were dead, captured, or scattered beyond any hope of reassembly. The artillery train was captured. Cannons that had been laboriously transported from Oxford, that represented irreplaceable manufacturing capacity, now belonged to Parliament. The baggage train was captured. Supplies, ammunition, personal belongings of officers and soldiers. The army's administrative apparatus, pay records, muster rolls, correspondence, and the king's cabinet. King Charles himself nearly fell captive on the field. Only the speed of his horse and the confusion of the rout allowed him to escape toward Leicester. As he fled, surrounded by the remnants of his lifeguard, Charles Stuart must have felt his worldview crumbling. He had believed victory was divinely ordained. He had believed God's anointed monarch could not be defeated by rebels and traitors. He had believed, truly, genuinely, with every fiber of his soul, that right made might. The corpses carpeting Naseby Field proved otherwise. But his personal correspondence did not escape. In the chaos of the rout, the wagon containing Charles's private letters was abandoned. Parliamentary soldiers, searching for plunder, found the iron-bound chest. They pried it open. They discovered papers bearing the royal seal. Within hours, those papers would reach Thomas Fairfax. Within days, they would reach Parliament. Within weeks, they would be published for all England to read. And 4 years later, they would help send King Charles I to the executioner's block. The Royalist baggage train was captured intact. Wagons, artillery, ammunition, personal belongings of officers and men, and a small iron-bound chest containing the king's private correspondence. Within hours of the battle's end, parliamentary officers were reading Charles's letters. What they found confirmed their darkest suspicions. Charles had been negotiating with Irish Catholics, promising concessions that would have outraged Protestant England. He had sought foreign military intervention, French, Danish, even troops from the Pope himself. He had systematically deceived Parliament during every attempted negotiation, making promises he never intended to keep. The king's own words revealed him as a liar. Parliament published these letters almost immediately. The king's cabinet opened, appeared in London bookshops within weeks, a propaganda coup beyond anything Oliver Cromwell could have manufactured. Public opinion, already strained by 3 years of war, turned decisively against Charles. The image of the noble sovereign defending ancient rights crumbled. In its place emerged something far more damaging, a shifty politician who treated his subjects' lives as bargaining chips. These letters would be read aloud at Charles's trial 4 years later. They would help justify the unthinkable. Regicide. If you appreciate stories like this, the raw, unvarnished truth of how history's most decisive moments unfolded, then consider subscribing to Not Nostalgic History. We dig into the details that other channels skip, finding the human stories buried beneath the dates and names. Your support helps us continue creating content that treats history with the seriousness it deserves. Now, let's return to the aftermath of Naseby and trace how this single battle reshaped the world. The battle was over. The dying continued. William Styles was a parliamentary pikeman from Suffolk. We know almost nothing about him. His name appears in a single regimental muster roll. He was probably in his 20s. He probably worked the land before the war. After Naseby, William Styles helped bury the dead. Contemporary accounts describe the field as something from nightmare. Bodies lay in windows where pike formations had met. Men had been trampled by cavalry until their faces were unrecognizable. Some wounded still moved, feebly, hopelessly, amid the carnage. The smell was already terrible by noon. Blood and excrement, gunpowder residue, the particular sweetness of exposed intestines baking in June sun. Details from soldiers' letters and later memoirs paint a picture of systematic horror. Royalist prisoners, stripped of weapons and valuables, sat in dejected clusters. Some wept, some prayed, some stared at nothing. The wounded received little care by modern standards. Surgeons on both sides worked frantically, but their tools were crude, some saws for shattered limbs, cautery irons for bleeding vessels, wine for cleaning wounds. Anesthesia did not exist. Men bit down on leather straps while their legs were removed. Many simply died where they fell. Parliamentary soldiers searched the dead for valuables, rings, coins, anything worth taking. This was standard practice in 17th century warfare. The dead had no further use for property. The stripped corpses were tumbled into mass graves. We do not know exactly where these graves lie. The field at Naseby has been ploughed for nearly 4 centuries. The bones of the fallen are presumably scattered beneath the crops. Anonymous, forgotten, their sacrifice absorbed by English soil. The Royalist baggage train contained more than correspondence. Camp followers accompanied 17th-century armies, wives, mistresses, prostitutes, laundresses, nurses. Hundreds of women and children traveled with Charles's forces. When parliamentary soldiers captured the baggage train, many of these women were attacked. Contemporary accounts describe violence that shocks even by the brutal standards of the age. Women accused of being Irish, or merely speaking with Irish accents, were killed outright. Parliament's propaganda had successfully demonized Irish Catholics as subhuman monsters. Soldiers felt they were executing demons rather than murdering women. Others had their faces slashed, a punishment for prostitution that left visible, permanent scars. Children witnessed these atrocities. Some were spared. Others disappeared into the chaos. The exact numbers will never be known. Estimates range from 100 to 300 women killed or maimed in the baggage train. Massacre. This was war in its ugliest form. Not noble cavalry charges, not principled stands for liberty. Raw violence inflicted on the most vulnerable, justified by religious hatred and propaganda. We do not glorify these events. We record them because they happened. Because forgetting them would dishonor the victims. Because understanding history requires confronting its horrors alongside its heroes. Colonel John O'Kay commanded 1,000 parliamentary dragoons, mounted infantry, who fought on foot. At Naseby, O'Kay positioned his men behind a hedge on the parliamentary left flank. Their role was unglamorous. Harass Royalist cavalry, protect the infantry's flank, fire from cover. When Rupert's cavalry charged past, O'Kay's dragoons poured fire into their exposed flanks. When the Royalist infantry advanced, O'Kay's men shifted position and fired into their ranks. They were not knights, they were not dashing cavaliers, they were professionals doing a professional's work. After the battle, O'Kay reassembled his scattered command. They had suffered minimal casualties. They had contributed significantly to victory. And they had demonstrated a new principle of warfare that disciplined firepower could neutralize cavalry shock. O'Kay would later become a regicide, one of the men who signed Charles I's death warrant. Then he would become a victim himself, executed after the Restoration for that same signature. Such was the English Civil War. Today's victor became tomorrow's traitor, depending on which faction held power. Naseby did not immediately end the war, but it ended any realistic hope of Royalist victory. King Charles fled to Wales after the battle. He attempted to raise new forces. He negotiated frantically with anyone who might provide troops, Irish Catholics, Scottish Presbyterians, French diplomats. Nothing worked. The new model army systematically reduced Royalist strongholds across England. Bristol fell in September 1645. Chester fell in February 1646. Oxford itself, the Royalist capital, surrendered in June. Charles surrendered to Scottish forces at Newark in May 1646. He apparently believed the Scots would support him against Parliament. He was wrong. The Scots eventually handed him over to Parliament in exchange for payment of their army's back wages. The First English Civil War was over, but the killing was not. Charles Stuart, even in captivity, could not stop scheming. From his imprisonment at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, he negotiated with Scottish moderates. He promised religious concessions in exchange for military intervention. In 1648, Scottish armies invaded England. Royalist uprisings erupted in Wales, Kent, and Essex. The Second Civil War had begun. It ended quickly. Cromwell crushed the Scottish invasion at Preston in August. Parliamentary forces suppressed the English uprisings with brutal efficiency, and public opinion shifted decisively. Parliamentarians had hoped for reconciliation with Charles. They imagined a constitutional settlement, the king restored to a limited throne, governed by parliamentary consent. The Second Civil War ended these hopes. Charles had proven himself incapable of keeping agreements. He had triggered renewed bloodshed after promising peace. He had invited foreign invasion of his own kingdom. Voices that once spoke of accommodation now spoke of judgment. On January 20th, 1649, King Charles I stood before a specially constituted court in Westminster Hall. The charge was treason. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority. He refused to enter a plea. He sat in contemptuous silence while prosecutors read the indictment, but they also read his letters. The correspondence captured at Naseby, those damning documents proving Charles's duplicity, formed a central element of the prosecution's case. Here was evidence, in the king's own handwriting, of systematic deception. Charles defended himself eloquently. He argued that no court could try an anointed monarch. He insisted that his cause was liberty itself, that if the king could be tried by his subjects, no Englishman's rights were safe. The court was unmoved. On January 27, 1649, Charles Stuart was sentenced to death as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. January 30th, 1649. A Tuesday, cold. Charles I walked through the banqueting house at Whitehall, a building he himself had commissioned, decorated with ceiling paintings by Rubens celebrating the divine right of kings. He stepped through a window onto a wooden scaffold. A crowd of perhaps several thousand watched in near silence. Charles spoke briefly. He declared himself a martyr for his people's liberty. He forgave his enemies. He prayed. Then he knelt. He placed his neck on the low block. He extended his arms, the signal for the executioner to strike. The axe fell once. The crowd groaned, a sound witnesses described as unlike anything they had heard before. Horror, relief, disbelief. A masked executioner lifted the severed head. 1,000 years of English monarchy by divine right ended in that moment. The execution of Charles I sent shockwaves across Europe. Monarchs who had dismissed the English troubles as a minor rebellion suddenly recognized a new and terrifying reality. Kings could be killed, not assassinated by lone fanatics, not overthrown by rival claimants, tried, convicted, executed by their own subjects. England became a republic, the Commonwealth, followed by the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. This experiment in kingless government lasted 11 years. It was not democracy as we understand the term. Cromwell ruled with near dictatorial power. He dissolved parliaments that displeased him. He imposed religious conformity as rigorously as any Stuart monarch. But the principle had been established. Sovereignty resided in the people, not in royal blood. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, when Charles II, son of the executed king, returned to claim his father's throne, the terms had fundamentally changed. Charles II was not restored by divine right. He was restored by parliamentary invitation. He accepted limits on royal power that his father had died refusing. The glorious revolution of 1688 completed this transformation. James II, attempting to rule as his grandfather had, was deposed without significant resistance. William and Mary accepted a Bill of Rights that made Parliament supreme. The shadow of Naseby stretched across these events. Every time a Stuart monarch overreached, opponents invoked the memory of 1645. Every time royal authority clashed with parliamentary prerogative, the threat was implicit: we have killed kings before. 130 years after Naseby, American colonists faced their own struggle against royal authority. The ideological heritage was direct. John Locke's theories of government and the philosophical foundation of American independence drew explicitly on the English Civil War's debates. The concept of natural rights, the idea that tyrannical governments could be legitimately overthrown, the principle that consent of the governed was the only legitimate basis for authority. All these emerged from the intellectual ferment of the 1640s. Thomas Jefferson owned copies of Civil War pamphlets. The Declaration of Independence echoed arguments parliamentarians had made against Charles I. When George III was denounced as a tyrant, the echo of Charles Stuart's trial resonated clearly. The American founders were not merely rebelling against taxation. They were inheriting a revolution that began on Naseby Field. The English Civil War was not unique. Across the 17th century, similar upheavals challenged absolute monarchy throughout Europe, the Fronde in France, the Dutch resistance to Spanish rule, the Catalan revolt, but England's revolution proved most consequential. Parliamentary government, limited monarchy, rule of law, religious toleration, eventually, free press, eventually. These principles, forged in England's civil wars, became templates for modern governance. When French revolutionaries executed Louis XVI in 1793, they explicitly cited English precedent. When liberal movements swept Europe in 1848, they drew on constitutional traditions rooted in English practice. When colonies across the globe sought independence in the 20th century, they built governments on English-derived parliamentary models. Naseby's shadow stretches across 4 centuries of political development. We began with a question. What was the fatal mistake that cost King Charles I his head? The obvious answer is military. Charles fought at Naseby when he should have retreated. He was outnumbered. His position was poor. His best cavalry commander charged when he should have waited. But the deeper answer is psychological. Charles Stuart could not imagine losing. He believed, with absolute unshakable conviction, that God had placed him on the throne and would preserve him there. This belief was not strategy. It was identity. When his council urged retreat, Charles heard cowardice. When his armies suffered defeats, Charles saw temporary setbacks. When his subjects demanded limits on royal power, Charles perceived rebellion against heaven itself. He could not compromise because compromise would mean admitting that his enemies had legitimate grievances. He could not negotiate honestly because deception served God's purpose, preserving the divinely ordained order. He could not stop fighting because defeat was literally unthinkable. This rigidity, this inability to see the world from any perspective but his own, was the fatal flaw. Naseby merely revealed it. History offers no shortage of leaders who shared Charles' blindness. Napoleon at Waterloo, Hitler at Stalingrad. Countless rulers convinced that destiny favored them, that defeat was impossible, that their cause was too righteous to fail. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Initial success breeds overconfidence. Overconfidence breeds contempt for opponents. Contempt breeds strategic errors. Strategic errors produce catastrophe. Charles I won battles. He held Oxford for 4 years. He inspired genuine devotion in thousands of loyal soldiers, but he never grasped the fundamental reality of his position. He was not fighting against Parliament. He was fighting against an idea, the idea that kings answer to their people. That idea could not be defeated by cavalry charges. The English Civil Wars killed an estimated 190,000 people in England alone. As a proportion of population, this exceeds English losses in World War I. Add Scotland and Ireland, and the death toll approaches 600,000, nearly 4% of the British Isles' population. These numbers numb us with their scale. They conceal individual tragedies. Young men bleeding out in hedgerows. Widows learning that their husbands died at Marston Moor or Naseby. Children orphaned when towns were sacked. Families split by allegiance, never reconciling. We do not glorify war. We cannot. Not honestly. But we study it because the consequences shaped our world. Because the men and women who lived through these horrors deserve to be remembered. Because understanding the past is the only path to avoiding its repetition. Stand on Naseby Field today. It is quiet now. Farmland stretches in every direction. A small obelisk marks the site. Occasionally, metal detectorists find musket balls or fragments of armor. Nothing visible indicates that the modern world was born here. But it was. When Prince Rupert's cavalry charged too far and Cromwell's discipline held, the trajectory of human civilization bent. When captured letters revealed a king's duplicity, the concept of royal infallibility shattered. When Charles Stuart walked to a scaffold and placed his neck on the block, the divine right of kings died with him. We live in a world that Naseby made possible. Constitutional government, popular sovereignty, the radical notion that rulers serve at the pleasure of the ruled. None of this was inevitable. Men chose it. They fought for it. They killed and died for it. Some were heroes. Many were not. Almost all believed God fought alongside them. They were wrong about the theology, but they were right about something more important. Power unchecked becomes tyranny. Tyranny can be resisted. Resistance, however bloody, however costly, sometimes wins. This is the lesson of Naseby. Not that war is glorious. It is not. Not that violence solves problems. It rarely does. But that history bends toward justice only when men and women bend it. The English Civil War was fought by ordinary people who believed extraordinary things were possible. Farmers became generals. Preachers became revolutionaries. A stammering king became a symbol of tyranny defeated. They paid in blood for the world we inherited. The least we can do is remember them.